Hi, I'm Michelle with Alive and Well Communities. Thanks for joining me for part 4. So we're doing a 4-part series on trauma awareness. In our first segment, we talked about the different types of trauma: private event, public event, community trauma, racial and historical trauma. And we talked about how that triggers our stress response system, which is an automatic response that is hardwired in our brain based on our past experiences. In our second segment, we talked about the ACEs study and talked about how adverse childhood experiences can have a long-term impact on our bodies. And then we also talked about how trauma impacts the brain, how that affects how we show up, how it manifests over the course of our lifetime. And now today we're going to talk about applying the lens of trauma. But I want you to think back to when we talked about how we changed the question from what's wrong with you, what's your problem, what's your deal, why can't you get your life together, to what happened to you? What's really going on? Being trauma informed is really about building relationships and offering one another a little bit of humanity. That's what it's about. It's about asking questions before we decide what is wrong with someone. I'm going to give you an example of an experience that I had as an educator. So I had a student who joined me halfway through the school year, and he was an amazing kid. He was just kind and courteous. And every day he would come in and he would ask how I was. How are you, Miss Roush? Do you need anything? What's going on? He was the kind of kid who would raise his hand and ask a question or answer questions, even if he didn't know the answers, which was a teacher's dream, because how wonderful is it to create a space where kids feel safe enough to mess up and still try? He would lead groups. He would lead conversations. He would volunteer to read. It was great for the first month. And then the second month that he came into my classroom, he was not so great. And he would come into the class and he would go to the other side of the classroom and pull his hood up and put his earbuds in and completely disengage and disconnect. And one of the things that they didn't teach me when I went to school was to remember not to take things too personally. And so I did. And I spoke with the student. I reminded him what the expectations were in my classroom, and the behavior stayed the same. And so I asked him to leave. I sent him out of my classroom to a buddy room. It was just too much of a distraction. Everybody wanted to know what was going on, what was wrong, instead of focusing on what we had to get done as in our classroom that day. And so when he came back a couple of days later, the behavior was the same and my response was the same. I asked him to leave the classroom. I never asked him any questions. I just asked him to leave. And when he was prepared to come back and do what he was supposed to do in my classroom, then he could come back to my room. On day 3, we had the same behavior and the same reaction, the exact same experience. Now, the following week, a friend of his came through the hallway and I stopped him and I said, "What is going on with your friend? He was great a month ago, and now he's just not. He's kind of a jerk." And he said, "Oh, Miss Roush, this week is his mom's birthday." And I was like, "Okay." He said, "Well, his mom passed away in November." And I thought, wow, I failed that kid. Not as a teacher, but just as a teacher, but just as a person, just as a human being, right? And so when he came back to class, I apologized, and I remember exactly what I said to him. And some of you may have heard me say this before if you've been in other trainings with me. I said, "I am so sorry that I decided what was wrong with you before I asked any questions. What do you need? What do you need to get through today, get through the week, get through the month?" And it doesn't have to be about school. It can be anything. What do you need to get through? And he said, "You know what, Miss Roush, it's been a really long time since I've had a hug." All he needed was a hug. So I gave him a hug, and he would come back every single day after that. And he would stand in the hallway with me and during passing time. And a couple years later, when I got moved to another building, he would run down and visit me down there. And then the next year after that, I decided to go teach 6th grade. And that year was really hard. And I remember one day leaving for lunch, going out to lunch, and I went to a local grocery store and I was going to get a salad from the salad bar. And I remember I was crying in the grocery store. I was like, "I'm not going back. I'm going to just go home. I've had enough." And as I'm crying in the grocery store, I suddenly hear this voice, "Miss Roush, is that you?" And there he was, that kid from my classroom. And he came out from behind the counter where he was working, and he came over to the middle of the store and he gave me a hug. When we apply the lens, when we change our perspective and we change the question from what's wrong with you to what happened, when we no longer are deciding what is wrong with other people, but we're building relationships that's asking questions so that we can figure out what is all the underlying stuff that explains the behavior. We change the question, we change the trajectory of trauma. And not only that, but we model the skills that are needed so that those kids can do the same thing for others later. Now, thankfully, I was the recipient. I was the other later for that student. But as we apply the lens today, I want you to remember that being trauma informed and changing the question is about removing blame from a situation. It's about no longer deciding what is wrong with people. It's about building relationships and asking questions and figuring out how do we create space for people to feel so that they can heal. And then the last step of that is how then do we challenge the environments? How do we challenge the policies and the procedures that might be in place that create obstacles toward healing, that create obstacles toward equity, that create obstacles that don't allow us the space that we need to feel, to heal, and to be successful. So today, we're going to apply the lens of trauma. All right. So when we apply the lens of trauma, remember that we are removing blame from a group of people and we're looking at the situation and we're figuring out how do we create an equitable environment where all people have the opportunity to be successful. So if we look at some of the statistics that we have here on the screen, we know that Black children under the age of 6 are about 3 times more likely to live in poverty than their peers. And over the last 4 decades, at least 1/3 of Black children were living in poverty. African Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Latin Americans have been impacted greatly by hypertension and diabetes. I would like to add Native Americans to that list as well, due to the chronic stress resulting from discrimination. So that is the perpetuation of historical traumas or racial traumas that create chronic stress that lead to those long-term health impacts like hypertension and diabetes. We also know that Native Americans are sentenced to prison at 4 times the rate of white Americans. There are a lot of other statistics that could be added to the screen, but when we apply the lens of trauma, we're no longer blaming the people in those situations, but we're looking at what the situation is and how trauma has impacted those situations. Large bodies of literature in public health and medicine document that not only that Black persons are more likely to experience stressful situations such as material hardship, interpersonal discrimination, structural discrimination, but that those experiences take a toll on the body. So those stressful experiences related to that hardship, related to discrimination, those things have a long-term impact on health, on the physical being and the mental being of a person. Now, here's a slide that demonstrates that shows us how that works in the medical field in particular in regards to prenatal care and the adequacy that of the prenatal care that people experience. Now, this is from the Missouri Index. So if we look over on the left-hand side, we're looking at the percentage of low birth weight births, okay? And down at the bottom, we're looking at the mother's education level, the level of education that the mother has experienced. Less than high school all the way on the left side, followed by high school degree, followed by some college, followed by college degree or more. And then we're looking at the differentiation of the experiences or the adequacy of prenatal care received, not only based on the education level of the mother, but based on whether or not they were African American or white. And we see that the percentage of low birth weights is tremendously higher for those African American women, no matter what their education level is, even those who have received a college degree or more. Now, this is an example of that systemic trauma, right? The systemic, when we looked back at the peeling away of the onion of trauma, we saw that individual trauma, and beneath it was community trauma. Beneath that was historical trauma, and beneath that was systemic issues, systemic oppression. And this is an example of how those systemic issues and historical traumas have perpetuated and still exist today in a way that creates less than equitable opportunity when it comes to prenatal care for women of color, or African American women in particular. Now, this is a little bit of a shift, but we're going to start to talk about our kids, our adolescents. And if you'll recall that last time we talked about the developmental stages, or the manifestation of trauma at different ages or stages of life, we said that adolescents were from the ages of 10 to 19. So we know that suicide is the second leading cause of death for adolescents ages 10 to 19 in the United States. The number one cause of death is accidents, and that's not differentiated in any way or categorized. It's just accidents. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for adolescents ages 10 to 19 in the United States. But kids who identify as sexual minorities, so kids that identify as members of the LGBTQIA plus community, have rates of suicide up to 3 times higher. 74% of sexual minority youth reported experiencing verbal harassment because of their sexual orientation. 33% reported physical harassment, and 72% reported cyberbullying. I would like you to keep in mind that these statistics are from a time prior to the pandemic. And so during the pandemic, when most of us went to a virtual environment, cyberbullying increased, and that's just based on informal conversations and informal reports. We don't have any statistics that demonstrate that, but we all know that being in a virtual environment was pretty difficult. Youth who identify as sexual minorities may skip school as a protective mechanism to avoid victimization. And research indicates that increased risk of suicide for sexual minority youth is due to the various forms of school-based victimization experienced. So applying the lens of trauma, understanding what the landscape is for our kids in general, but also for our kids who identify as sexual minorities, how do we create a safe space, an equitable space for those students in our school communities? This is a recent statistic. This chart is from the Trevor Project of 2021, and it compares the past year suicide attempts of cisgender kids versus transgender or non-binary kids. So you'll see across the bottom the different races: American Indian, Alaska Native, all the way on the left, followed by Asian and Pacific Islander. Next, we have Black, African American. Then we have Hispanic and Latinx, white, non-Hispanic, or kids who identify as 2 or more. And you'll see there is a tremendous difference in the suicide attempt percentages based on, in comparison, from cisgender to transgender or non-binary. There's not as much of a differentiation in American Indian and Alaska Native, and that is because suicide is the number one cause of death for young people in the Native community. As we continue to look at how we apply the lens of trauma, I want to look at some school-specific statistics or school-specific information. So Black and low-income students receive longer suspension than their peers for the same types of infractions. It's something that we see within the legal system in general, and we see the exact same thing mirrored in schools. While Black students only account for 16% of enrollment across the country. So that means that not just that, it does not mean that only 16% of Black kids are in school. What it means is that 16% of all enrollment across the country is Black kids. While they account for only 16% of total enrollment across the country, they represent more than 30% of school-based arrests. Research suggests that Black students are frequently disciplined for minor infractions such as defiance or disrespect, which is why it's critical for us as educators to learn and to love our communities, the communities in which we work. Because if we don't, oftentimes that disagreement might feel like defiance or disrespect when it's really passion. It's really somebody who just feels strongly about a situation, or it's the way that a person communicates based on their experiences growing up or based on how they learn from others, right? And so when we build relationships and we apply the lens of trauma and understand that not everything is about us, I know that's hard. When we understand that not everything is about us and we apply that lens of trauma, we might understand or we might recognize the passion instead of seeing it as defiance or disrespect. We have to build relationships. That's the key. Lastly, suspensions contribute to chronic absenteeism. Okay, so we know that every single school district has a goal of improving graduation rates. If kids aren't in school, they can't learn. And if they can't learn, they can't earn grades. And if they can't earn grades, they can't graduate. So when we apply the lens of trauma and we start to see things from a trauma lens perspective, we become less punitive and more restorative. The goal is to keep them in class. Let's keep them in there. What do we have to do to make that happen? And building relationships is the foundational piece that is critical to making sure that we do that. And then changing the question from what's wrong with you? What's your problem? Why can't you get your life together? I don't understand why you keep doing the same thing over and over again, even though I've asked you not to what happened? What happened to you? What's really going on, right? Making sure that every kid has that connection to somebody who can be that one unwavering, buffering, supportive person that could change the trajectory of trauma over the course of their lifetime, right? All right, so this is a chart that shows enrollment versus discipline across the country. And so if you look at the bottom, you'll see the color coding there. At the very bottom, the blue at the very bottom is 2 or more races. And then coming up from the bottom, that little orange sliver is Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. Then the gray is white. The yellow is black. The light blue at the top is Hispanic or Latino. The little sliver of green is Asian. And then the sliver of dark blue up at the very top is American Indian or Alaska Native. So what we see coming from the left to the right is the left is enrollment. That's the number of kids or the percentage of kids that are enrolled in each of those categories or each of those groups, right? Next, we see 1 or more out of school suspensions. So in comparison to the percentage by race of kids who are enrolled, what percentage are experiencing 1 or more out of school suspensions? So what percentage of total out of school suspensions are indicated by each race or indicated for each race? So this chart actually says that only 15.1% of total enrollment across the country is Black, but those 15.1% account for 38.2% of all out of school suspensions. The next one, the pillar in the very middle, represents expulsions, the percentage of expulsions. And then the second to last one from the right is the referrals to law enforcement. And then the last column all the way on the right is school arrests. Now, this was published in June of 2021, so it's been updated. The original data collection was done in 2017, 2018, but this was just recently published. So how do we create an environment that is trauma informed and that is trauma responsive and that is trauma sensitive, that creates an equitable opportunity for all students, for all of our kids? Well, we do that by leaning into the core principles. And the core principles are sort of the foundation of everything that we do here at Alive and Well. The core principles are the foundation of creating a trauma-informed environment or a trauma-informed school. So you'll see that there are 5 core principles: trustworthiness, empowerment, safety, collaboration, and choice. And centered among those things is equity. So what that means is that when we're considering trustworthiness, we're also thinking about how to make that equitable. When we're considering empowerment, we're also thinking about how to make that equitable. Trustworthiness being the possibility for trust. It's an environment where trust is possible, right? Where people might feel like they could potentially build that trust. And how do we create an equitable opportunity for all people to have that experience? Empowerment is exactly what it sounds like. It's how do we give voice to everyone? And again, how do we create an equitable opportunity for everyone to have voice? Now, remember, when we're talking about equitable, we're talking about equity. There's a difference between fairness and equity. Fairness is I'm giving you all the exact same thing. Equity is I'm giving you each what you need in order to be successful. Safety is going to be unique and individual from person to person too, right? What's going to make someone feel safe emotionally, physically, mentally? Make it feel safe for people to make mistakes and still continue on, right? Whatever that is for your classroom or for your school environment. Collaboration is creating opportunities for people to work together and also creating opportunities for people to create change, for people to inform policies and procedures. And then choice, giving folks choice and being mindful that oftentimes people don't act on their choice because past experiences have shown when they do, the outcome isn't always great. And so how do we create space for people in that way too, and create an equitable opportunity for people to experience choice or to act on it? When we are trauma informed, what that means is that we realize the widespread impact of trauma and we understand the potential paths for recovery. We recognize signs and symptoms of trauma in clients and staff and family and anybody within our school community or within our community. And then we respond by fully integrating the knowledge that we've gained about trauma into our policies and procedures and practices, right? So for example, if we have we are promoting self-care, but we don't create the space for people to self-care, then it's not integrated fully into our policies, procedures, and practices. And then lastly, we want to seek to actively resist re-traumatization. And if we do re-traumatize, what do? We apologize and we figure out, we work together to figure out, we collaborate and figure out how do we move forward to create the possibility for trustworthiness in the future, right? When it comes to interventions, there are many therapeutic interventions that are effective and available for all ages through various individual or group modalities, but that might not necessarily be the solution for some folks, but it could be. What we do know is that trauma is not cured. Therapeutic intervention is not going to change what happened, right? It's not going to erase the experience. That thing happened and that's not going to go away. And we might have to consider additional interventions over the course of our lifespan at different points in life when different changes occur. What we know for sure is that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. And as I've mentioned, everybody just needs one unwavering, buffering, supportive person that can mitigate the trajectory of their trauma, can change the future for them. So as we're responding to trauma, we want to acknowledge that we may unintentionally trigger someone's trauma response. And it's okay. We have to apologize when that happens, right? We want to work to see an individual's responses and behaviors as a result of changes in the brain and the body. So when there is a trauma trigger or when someone is experiencing one of those flashbulb memories, remember that there's changes occurring in the brain and in the body that are causing that response. And then strive to see the world through a lens of trauma. How do we change our perspective and therefore change the question from what's wrong with you to what happened? What happened to you? And what can I do to help you get through today or through the week or through the month or however long it takes? How do we create communities of care around one another? One more little video and then we're going to wrap. Here you go.